Did they tell you you had syphilis?
Nothing like that. They'll do that, draw my blood. We'll see you next time. And that's it.
That's it.
The men had no idea they were being used as guinea pigs in an experiment designed to follow them to their death.
Hello, and welcome back to Murder, She Told. I'm Madison, and if you're new here, please stay tuned and see if you like what I'm giving on this channel. If you end up loving it, please like and subscribe for more. Press that bell notification so you know when I post and I upload, and please comment and interact with the video down below. It boosts it in the algorithm, obviously, and I would love to hear your opinions on this topic. Now, today we are going to be discussing, in another installment of True Crime in Society, we're going to be discussing the Tuskegee Experiment, and we're specifically going to be discussing it through the lens of true crime, but as it relates to the vaccine hesitancy in the Black community for the COVID vaccine. Now, a lot of times there are different types of people in the Black community who quote and, kind of place different types of different reasons for not getting the COVID vaccine. One of the main reasons that is most quoted is the Tuskegee Experiment. So we're going to talk about it today, facts only, and I'm going to kind of discuss why using this as an example for the COVID vaccine doesn't exactly make sense, and how the common understanding of the Tuskegee Experiment overall is not fully correct. And because of that incorrectness of how it's understood in the Black community, it has led to vaccine hesitancy in the Black community, which I think we need to get vaccinated, people. Let me put a disclaimer up. Disclaimer. I am a child of an incredibly medical family. I am a child whose grandparents were in the medical field in the 60s and were really great people in the field. My grandpa was a doctor. He was an ear, nose, and throat doctor locally, and he's well known, just recently retired, but he's been working for years. And my other grandpa was a general care physician, very well known as well, and worked for Kaiser for years and years and years. So, and both my grandmas were nurses. So my relationship to doctors' offices, and tests and shots and things like that were just a part of my childhood. My mom's also a nurse. My aunt's also a doctor. When I tell you it runs deep in my family, it runs deep. But I just grew up in a hospital, pretty much. I had asthma growing up. I had severe allergies. I had eczema. So I was always at a doctor's appointment growing up. And I honestly feel very comfortable in the doctor's office. And I know that's a privilege. Absolutely. And I can recognize that. That is definitely a privilege. I fall asleep in the dentist chair because it's so nice to get my teeth cleaned. I love the dentist. I look forward to it. So that's my ministry. So, and that's my lineage. So I am somebody who deeply trusts science, and I know that science changes. I know that things change, but I trust the scientific process a lot. But that doesn't discount, and I think it's important to say, how said scientific process has wronged specifically Black people over time and people of color. And a lot of the findings that we know to be true and we rely on now to this day were found in racially insensitive experiments, or just fully taking advantage of enslaved people, things like that have a really dark history, which also contributes to why Black people in general are generally very suspicious of doctors because of generational trauma. And that's just what it is. I'm just going to say this before we get into this. Sorry, I'm burping. I just had ramen. It was so good. Okay. I'm going to say this. Black people, please get the vaccine. Do not be caught with your pants down. There have been so many stories of people of all shades who didn't get the vaccine, who have died or on their deathbed wanted the vaccine or express that they made a mistake after they recovered and have long-term symptoms of COVID. And I just want you to understand that, of course, healthy diets and juicing and whatever Dr. Sebi talks about in his like really healthy diet, and that's a conversation for another day because anyway, that is great in addition to also medical attention. It doesn't take over the importance of having doctors and having medical influence in your life. It doesn't cure cancer, as many people like to think, especially people in the religion that I grew up in, but that's another conversation for another day. It's important that you put a healthy long-term habits in your life, as well as making sure you go to the doctor to get your physical, to do preventative care, just in case something is found. Because healthy people get sick too. And I think it's important that, we kind of understand and dismiss a lot of the hesitancy to get this vaccine, and I understand it. We have had a hard life of it in this country in general, specifically when it comes to doctors. Black women are 7 times more likely to die in labor than white women. We know of many, many instances of how racist science or pseudoscience has affected our communities. And I remember there's a statistic going around that over 50% of new doctors, believe that Black people and white people don't feel pain the same, which is also alarming. And I get that. There have been instances where doctors haven't taken me seriously in the office as well. But there are important ways that you can combat that. And one of those ways is asking them to document that they denied you care or denied you a test, so that they will, in the process, when looking through your chart, people will be able to clock that and it'll go on them in terms of denying you that. That's just a little tip. That's a tip that's been flying around social media for years, so I don't even know if that's even like helpful to people anymore. But I say all this to say I understand that we have a very rough go of it when it comes to doctors' health in this country, and I'm not trying to point a finger or dismiss those feelings. Where I'm coming from, as somebody who is of a medical family and has a long legacy of doctors and nurses in her lineage, I can honestly say the scientific process and the medical situation as it stands today has done me pretty well. And I have gotten both the vaccine. I'm about to get my booster later on in this month. And I fully, expect to feel, kind of sickly. A lot of people have been feeling different symptoms with the booster, but I fully am willing to take that risk over getting this new Omarion, as they're calling it, the Omarion variant, because I don't want to risk it. And there's old people in my life. I still have all 4 of my grandparents still alive that I visit weekly. And so I am willing to be the sacrificial lamb to do whatever it takes to be vaccinated. So, to protect them. So, that's my little disclaimer. I'm just putting that out there. And we are going to get into the Tuskegee Experiment soon. I think before we get into the specific story of the Tuskegee Experiment, it's important to discuss what it feels like being Black in America and how those feelings have been compounded due to the pandemic. Being Black in America it's a combination of a lot of high highs and very, very low lows. And I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. I think being Black is the shit, and I know that to be true, but that doesn't shield me from the painful histories that we are taught and learn, and all of these racial things that we have to go through, and the obstacles we have to go through, and all of these things. Like it can be really high and exciting, but it can also be super, super low. And so when it comes to Black people and medicine, the intersections of race and gender and complexities around those things begin to really show up because of the really, really negative way white people were able to make important scientific discoveries at the direct expense of Black lives and Black bodies. The father of gynecology, you can Google this, and he's been called and revered as the father of gynecology forever. The dark history behind that is he would do experiments on enslaved women to look at their anatomy and to learn about what goes on down there health-wise, often without anesthesia. Often these women would be dead, would be killed, suffer complications from what he was doing, but because they are enslaved women, they were thought to be disposable. So again, you're welcome for discoveries about gynecology, because a lot of that wouldn't have happened without the unfortunate sacrifice of life and extreme trauma done to enslaved African women. Henrietta Lacks, that's an important book that a lot of Black people should read, about her HeLa cells and how they still are alive and well today, and her family hasn't been compensated, and this and that. Like, there's so many stories of just scientific racism and how it affects the Black community specifically, and how we are often written out and erased from the historical text when it comes to discoveries about certain diseases, certain cells, certain cures, certain fields of health in general. So I just want to say that I understand the vaccine hesitancy right now. Just because it happened very quickly, I can understand why people are like, well, what is it? What is it? I feel weird about it. Because there is a natural suspicion for the medical profession as a Black person in general. After the Tuskegee experiment happened, I think it was like the life expectancy of Black men dropped 1 point something percent into the 80s, because there was just a general distrust of the medical field, and a lot of Black men specifically stopped going to the doctors, meaning they stopped getting regularly screened for things that could have been preventative if caught early. So our suspicion was so intense after what happened in the Tuskegee experiment that the whole population of Black males' life expectancy went down 1% and some change. So if you want to know how deep it goes that fucking deep. And I can understand people's hesitations and qualms about getting the COVID vaccine, but I really, really urge you guys to do it. I really want us to be protected, and I want us to be safe. And I know it seems kind of anecdotal, like I took it and I'm fine and blah, blah, blah. But I promise you, this is probably the best decision you can make for your health, for your family. So please take this seriously and please get the vaccine. Ginger root and bee pollen and, sea moss is not going to cure you from COVID and the long-term effects of it. So, again, please get it. Please get it. I'm begging you, Black people, please, just get the vaccine, please. Let the white people do this bullshit. Okay? Love you. Okay. The Tuskegee Experiment. Why am I shaking and dancing like it's an exciting thing? It's actually super fucking messed up and super depressing. A little bit about me and this information. I learned about this. I've heard about it for years, but specifically learned about it again in college, like in detail. So this has always sat wrong with me. It's always used as an example in sociology classes. It's always used as an example in sociology classes as to how not to conduct an experiment. This and the Berkeley prison experiment or whatever are used as examples as to not and how to not conduct experiments. So I always knew it in reference to that. But of course, it's being pulled up again in the face of COVID and why Black people shouldn't take the vaccine. So we're going to talk about all of that right now. So syphilis, let's talk about her. Syphilis is the center point of this whole story. And I think it's important to quickly go through very casually syphilis, what it is, who has had it, and what it can potentially do to the body. And, just cures and things like that, because this is central to the Tuskegee Experiment story. Now, syphilis is a bacterial infection commonly passed through sexual activity between two partners, one being infected. It usually shows up as like a painless sore on either the mouth, the front part, or the back part of your body, of your sexual organs. And like I said, painless sore, and it usually can lay dormant in the body for years. The initial stages, there are 3 stages of syphilis, and the initial 2 stages are generally not necessarily intensely damaging on the body. In the first stage, obviously you get that sore. In the second stage, you can get white patches on your mouth and have like blotches on your palms and get more of those sores around your sexual organs and stuff like that. The tertiary aspect, or the third round or level of syphilis, is the most severe, and you can really get some major symptoms from that. You can get, and long-lasting symptoms like early onset dementia, vision loss, hearing loss. What else can you get from it? Heart disease, just brain damage, things like that in general. But I say all that to say, nowadays, it's extremely easy to treat. It is extremely easy to treat. But it's super important that us as sexually active people get tested on a regular basis, especially if you are having sex with multiple partners or new partners. It's super important to get tested regularly so you're able to catch these things before it goes on too long. Because with syphilis, it kind of shows up and goes away, and it shows up and goes away. It's one of those things where if you're not getting tested regularly so you can see the changes in your sexual health, it could go on unnoticed in your body, and you can be passing it on to people unknowingly for years. So that's that. So we'll start with that. What else? Syphilis is often quoted as to being first discovered in 1492 after Columbus came back from his voyage or whatever. And kind of went on from there. A lot of different countries, syphilis was widespread for a long time. It was widespread throughout a lot of Europe and just everywhere. And a lot of people, before there was actually an effective treatment, lived their whole lives with syphilis at points in time. So a lot of people went crazy due to syphilis and died of syphilis related, symptoms and things like that back in the day, because there was obviously no cure, or they died due to the cures or the antidotes to syphilis that really weren't in the day, like mercury. I believe taking mercury was a way to, not have syphilis, which killed you and damaged you more than it helped you, I think, in the process. There are a lot of famous people who had syphilis. It's often quoted that Al Capone died in Alcatraz with syphilis, syphilis-related complications. It is said that Nietzsche had syphilis, that Adolf Hitler had syphilis, and that Vladimir Lenin had syphilis, along with many, many other big historical figures are either known or speculated to have had syphilis in some capacity, or to have died of syphilis into some capacity. It's rumored that Van Gogh had syphilis at a point, or not at a point, but just had syphilis in general, which probably explains the whole ear thing, but, it's speculative, so whatever. Yeah, so syphilis is super common, and it has been around for centuries. Many countries didn't want to take personal responsibility for syphilis, so they'd blame their neighbors. So, all around Europe, they'd be pointing the finger. In Russia, they'd say it's a Polish disease, and in England, they'd say it's a German disease, and in Italy, they'd say it's a French disease. So, no one wanted to take responsibility. The reality is, people were having a bunch of dirty, unprotected sex, and this was something that just came out of that. It was a venereal disease. It fucking happens. And so there's a lot of just kind of plausible deniability about where it started and stuff like that, because, there's a lot of bad juju around having syphilis or carrying syphilis or spreading syphilis. So it's been around. Thank God it's super largely treatable to this day. The most effective way to get rid of syphilis is through the use of penicillin, and we'll get more into that a little later in this discussion. It is important that you get tested every 6 months or every time you have a new sexual partner. And being adamant about that does not make you a bad person. It is important to demand to see people's sexual health, tests before you engage with them sexually, just because you can't always go by their word. And it's so important to just, as an adult who is sexual, totally fine, very sex positive here, love it for you and all of that, but it's important that you're doing it safely and responsibly, and that's part of what you're tasked with once you become a sexually active person, is being responsible and taking care of your body as well as the person you're sleeping with's body by being open, honest, and communicative about what's going on with you sexually health-wise. So get tested, folks, and don't be ashamed if you do come out with an STI. It's very common and it's fine, and a lot of them are largely treatable to this day, including HIV and AIDS. So don't be shy. It's important. If you're having sex with someone, they deserve to know. But yeah, that's the background on syphilis, which is highly treatable. So if you have it, don't feel bad. Just get treated for it. Get the penicillin. You can do this. Okay. Oh, and another important thing before I continue and move out of the just general sexual health section of this, syphilis can be passed down to an unborn fetus through the mother. So again, sexual health is important. Get tested, be vigilant, be honest, be communicative. Do it. So the Tuskegee Experiment started around the 1920s and the 1930s, so early 20th century vibes with that one. And it's important to say that very little was known about the cure to syphilis at this point. Syphilis has been running its raggedy ass all over people's lives for centuries at this point, and still little was known about how to actually cure it. So for people at that time, syphilis was really a long time disease. So you'd kind of just naturally go through the 3 layers of syphilis and die due to complications, whether it was dementia, whether it was heart failure due to syphilis. It was just a lifelong thing that you would sort of kind of be able to treat through mercury, which, is super dangerous to be ingesting. But a lot of people were ingesting it in order to cure their syphilis. So little was known about the cure going into the 30s, the late 20s and the 30s, but more and more people were getting it. And I think it has a lot to do with, the culture of the 20s, the freedom, the excess, If you've ever read The Great Gatsby, you know what that time period was generally about. So, I have a feeling that has to do with it, but there was just the cases were just going up and up and up and up and up. And this is kind of the inception of the Tuskegee Experiment. Now, It wasn't originally called the Tuskegee Experiment. That comes later. But there was a push by the United States government to try and figure out and study syphilis as more and more people were getting it, to try and find a cure in order to kind of combat the widespread, syphilis epidemic that was happening during this time. So the initial inklings of what would later turn out to be the Tuskegee Experiment were pushed onto the public. So in the 20th century, the United States Public Health Service, also known as PHS, was tasked with trying to study and find cures, accurate cures for diseases that were affecting the population in mass. And so the PHS was separated into two groups, and one of those groups was specifically focusing on VD, or venereal diseases, and which, we obviously know are sexually transmitted diseases. So there's a whole section of the PHS that was focusing on venereal diseases at this time, namely syphilis. Between 1929 and 1931, an organization called the Roswell Fund sponsored a joint project with the PHS to study syphilis specifically in the African American population in the South. Now, the Roswell Fund was kind of like a modern day nonprofit which focused on providing health care to poor African American communities throughout the South. They would provide little healthcare services and show up in town and help check people out and things like that, which is honestly amazing for that time period. But they partnered with the PHS to observe the intense syphilis outbreaks amongst African American populations. Now, we're going to just quickly pause here and say this. There is a very high population of African Americans, specifically in the South, who had syphilis. African American males specifically who lived with syphilis. And that was a known fact. Now, during that time period, a lot of that was associated to very racist scientific rhetoric about Black males and the Black male population. Honestly, what we know now is because they were poor and illiterate due to the effects of slavery. They didn't have access to education about proper safe sex practices and, the signs of syphilis and things like that. They weren't even really in a place where they had access to regular health care unless they were being directly benefited from the Roswell Fund. So they kind of, correlation and causation are not always the same thing. Because of the poverty, lack of education, and other, situations with just being a Black person in America, in the South particularly, they didn't have access to the information that would probably lend them to lead different types of lives when it came to sexual situations and sexual health. And so overwhelmingly, the statistics show that Black men had one of the highest percentages of syphilis in the United States during this time. So again, causation and correlation, two different things. It's important because they use that statistic as a means to justify the very racialized scientific rhetoric that Black men were very dumb and were underdeveloped mentally, but were overdeveloped sexually, and they had a particular proclivity to wanting to have sex with white women, which led to, the Emmett Till murder, sentiments behind that. These things still kind of exist in our society today, and these sentiments towards Black men still exist in our society today. It has not really gone away, but it's just not as public. But, these similar sentiments led to, the murder of Emmett Till, led to, were central in Birth of a Nation, led to 1,000,001 lynchings all over the South, in the late 19th century, and even in the early 19th century, 20th century, and even, Emmett Till was in the 50s, for God's sake. So I want to just say this, it's important to understand that, yes, the statistics were factual, but the interpretation of the statistics were wrong and definitely racialized in order to, again, show that Black people were subhuman and Black men should be, you should be fearful of them, and they're kind of this rapacious, savage, sexual creature, which is not true. It's just because there was no education, no sexual health classes or education, and many of these people were illiterate and poor and just generally didn't have access to healthcare anyway. So, yeah. Moving on. So this combined project with the Roosevelt Fund and the PHS was essentially at first to figure out which population in the South had the highest concentration of positive syphilis African American males. That was the intention. And the intention was to study this population while also treating them for their syphilis at the same time, while observing the effects of the syphilis on their bodies at the same time. This situation, this project was only meant to last like 6 to 9 months in general. And I want to highlight this in particular. The intention of the first iteration of the Tuskegee experiment was to actually treat these men through the Roosevelt Fund. Roosevelt Fund was to actually provide treatment for these men. It wasn't until later it got perverted and turned into more of a racialized situation, which we'll get into later. But I want to put this in perspective. I want to put a couple things in perspective, especially to the Black people who use this as why they won't get the COVID vaccine. One, originally they were supposed to get treatment, and that treatment was later decided upon to be rescinded. So that's what happened in the Tuskegee experiment. Two, the Tuskegee experiment and the common misconception in the Black community is that you were injected with syphilis. But that's not what happened. They found a population of men who had syphilis already and were in the second stage of syphilis specifically, and they essentially were denied treatment of said syphilis. So it wasn't this freaky, they injected us with this stuff. Not saying that's never happened. There's experiments where that has happened, and that's rightfully so. But using this and citing this as an example of the government injecting Black people with specific things that they didn't do to white people, the reality is this population of people were sought out because there was a high percentage of them who already had syphilis in the second level of syphilis. And so they were being observed, and the original intention was for them to be studied and treated. But of course, racism happened. So we'll continue. So through the initial phase of the PHS and Roosevelt Fund project around the syphilis experiment, they were able to identify Macon County in Alabama as having the highest percentage of African American males living with syphilis in the second stage. And that was around, I believe, 35% of the African American male population had syphilis in the second stage. So that was identified as a place where the experiment was going to happen. And then the Depression hits in 1931, which is why this was such a short-lived thing from 1929 to 1931. The Depression hits, the Roosevelt Fund gets basically dried up. They can no longer fund the project, but the PHS still wants to continue with this project. So the Roosevelt Fund is no longer part of it. And remember, they were the ones who raised money and had all of that money specifically to help the Black community with medical care. And like I said, it was like a modern day nonprofit. So once their money dries up and they're no longer in the picture, the governmental arm of the PHS, the Public Health Services Department, wants to continue the experiment without the oversight of the Roosevelt Fund. So here we go, getting into where things get really fucked up. After the Roosevelt Fund left the PHS in terms of this syphilis thing that they were trying to do, after they zeroed in Macon County, Alabama, And the Great Depression hit. They were no longer a part of it. So the PHS still needed funding and help to conduct this experimental process around syphilis. So they ended up discussing it with the Tuskegee Institute, which was, as we all know, a black college in the day. And, the PHS basically reached out to the Tuskegee to see if they would help conduct and fund this project. And again, it was pitched in a similar way where, they're going to go into Macon County and observe the effects of syphilis for 6 to 9 months, and then also provide treatment for those who had syphilis in the process as they were getting their information about how the disease works in the body and things like that. That was what was originally pitched to Tuskegee. Obviously, that's not what ended up happening, and unfortunately the name Tuskegee stuck in terms of what happened to this population of men, but that's how they ended up starting. That's where the name Tuskegee came through working with the Tuskegee Institute in order to fill that gap of funding that was left when the Roosevelt Fund left the situation because of the Great Depression. So the Tuskegee Institute agreed to go into this experiment with the PHS and basically, observe the syphilis and the effect of syphilis on the Black African American male. They were so adamant and excited about it that even the university hospital doctor was a part of the experiment. But the original doctor that was supposed to lead the experiment only stayed for 1 year because he started to smell something funky in the milk. Essentially, they agreed upon a term limit of 6 months to a year, and when the year date started to come around, the original doctor who was supposed to lead out this experiment started to get suspicious that they weren't trying to wrap up the experimental process and disclose and publish their findings. He thought it was suspicious that they wanted to continue on with the experiment for another who knows how long, but it was only supposed to be 4 years time, and then these people would get their treatment. And so he decided to completely leave the experiment after the first year. And the Tuskegee experiment continued on without him for several decades. And he was right to leave. I wish he would have blown the whistle a little earlier, but he was right to leave because he thought that it was really irresponsible and unethical that they originally said that this was going to be a year-long observation process for their scientific process, but they wanted to extend it longer, and they wanted to extend it longer, and he wasn't comfortable with it, so he dipped, and rightfully so. So the PHS ended up enrolling 600 Macon County African American men. 399 had syphilis and 201 did not have syphilis. They were the control group. But here's the thing. None of them knew what they were participating in, which is kind of where the big ethical red flags start to beam. Anyone knows that there is a scientific process to experiments, and there's, different versions of experiments. There's the blind, there's a double blind, there's a voluntary, there's ups and downs for each one. The messed up part about this is these men, this whole experiment was presented to a population of Black men and Black families, really, that did not have access to healthcare. They lived in a rural place in the South, and they were widely poverty stricken. So seeing a doctor regularly, having access to normal healthcare was not something that was part of their ministry. So what the PHS did was present the experiment as, we're here to generally provide you guys, the males at first, with free health care. And we're going to, check in on you, and, it's no cost to you, this, and that, don't trip about it, blah, blah, blah. Well, the black men were generally suspicious of that. So they came up with the idea of expanding the free healthcare to the families and the children and the wives of the men who ended up being chosen for said experiment, though they just thought they were getting free healthcare, which is very misleading and wrong, because I think with situations like this, especially because these men were not told that they had syphilis. So these men were initially screened, and then they picked the 600 men that they wanted to work with for the experiment, and none of them knew if they were in the control group or if they were not. That's not the problem. The issue is these men had a deadly, sexual STI situation in syphilis, and gone untreated for long enough, it will cause serious health issues. And the fact that they were not even going to tell these men, yeah, you have syphilis, but we're trying different treatments, and let them consent to being a guinea pig or whatever, then maybe it would be a different situation. But they basically were like, oh, we're just in here, we're setting up shop, and we're providing you and your families with free health care, period, without understanding what was really going on. I think is really unfortunate and really shady. Unfortunately, what the men were told was that they had bad blood, which is a kind of colloquial term used in the black community at that time that filled a bunch of different health issues. So diabetes, gout, all of these things, syphilis, all of these things were considered under the big umbrella of what bad blood meant. So it still was generalized. They were told that they had bad blood and this is why they were getting health care, but they weren't told specifically what they had and the treatments and what exactly was being done to them and why they were being chosen for this experiment. So they had no agency to consent to the realities of what they would end up going through. They just thought they were in a situation where they're being provided free healthcare by the government, by the grace of God, for their entire family. So a lot of people were willing to sign up and participate for this without knowing the depths and the truth of what would happen to them. So again, here we go with the effed upness. Here we're starting, and it gets worse. It gets worse. Just know that it gets worse. So, in addition to being promised free healthcare for them initially, then expanding it to them and their families for further incentivization to continue in the experiment, they were also promised free meals and burial plots for their family and themselves, as long as they were allowed to conduct an autopsy on their bodies beforehand. Again, nobody knew they had syphilis. Nobody knew they didn't have syphilis. They just thought that this was a governmental program. So they thought they were lucky. They were getting free meals. They were getting treated better than most poor white people at the time, with access to healthcare regularly, checkups regularly, free food, free burial plot, free funeral expenses being covered. So it seemed like a dream come true in terms of what was being offered. But of course, they had no idea what they were giving up in the process. So again, another shady tactic of doing human experiments on people without giving them the proper agency to decide whether this is good for them, whether they're willing to weigh the risks out of this or not. So super shady. And when they were confronted later, the PHS, of course, about why they lied to the participants, they knew. They were like, who would agree to this? Who would agree to being watched and untreated for having syphilis? Who would consent to that? So they lied. So that's why they lied. And that's the exact explanation as to when asked directly why they lied. That's why they lied. Because it's true. Who would agree if they knew they had some sort of VD, venereal disease situation, STI situation, or just in general, something was wrong with their health? Who would agree to go without treatment just to be observed? Especially when these people weren't given money. These people were just given things that I think, to me, are basic human rights like healthcare and a meal. But They weren't given money. They weren't given, they were given healthcare, a meal, and a burial plot in exchange for an autopsy for their bodies. That's it. So, I think the consent angle also opens up, how much are you willing to spend on this? I believe almost everybody has a price, and some people in a desperate enough situation, if they were being incentivized by cash, would probably agree to do it. But I think that they knew that they couldn't get as big of a sample size and as, ideal of a sample size if they fully disclose what was happening from the jump. And they knew that, so they intentionally lied to these people and their families, which is messed up. So like I said before, their funeral expenses were covered if the family allowed for the PHS to perform an autopsy. They were never told why the autopsy was being performed. Another important thing to note is, these checkups weren't pleasant. They happened often, and they were often really, really painful. There were unnecessary spinal taps. There are all sorts of painful, rigorous experiments done to check up on the people who had syphilis in their bodies, even though they didn't even know they had syphilis. So, it was a process to continue to have these men trust them, and the incentives weren't even brought up front. The child care, the child health care, the wife health care, the food, and the burial plot were all things added secondarily in order to further incentivize these men to continue going through these painful experiments. So, first they didn't want to because their wives and children weren't going to have it, and they were suspicious of that. So they expanded the health care to the wives and kids. Then, they go through the experiments a little bit and realize that it's extremely painful. It's extremely invasive. They're doing spinal taps on me. They're making me do a lot of rigorous activity. And so a lot of men started to drop out. So in order to incentivize them, they added the free meals, they added the burial plot, in order to incentivize these men into continuing on with this experiment, even though they didn't really know the true nature of what was happening. They were sick. A lot of these men were sick, and they had no clue. They just thought they were getting, free healthcare, which is really fucking shitty. The PHS, of course, denies the racial aspect of it. They basically are, deny that their whole answer for why they lied was specifically because they knew they couldn't get that big of a sample size anywhere if they were honest about what they were doing. But a lot of people learned to, rightfully so, assume that there were heavy racial undertones when it came to why this particular population was chosen and why they weren't communicative about what was going on with them, especially after a doctor from the PHS there was some sort of letter that was sent that was kind of found out and exposed, where the doctor in the letter says this: "These Negroes are very ignorant and easily influenced by things that would be of minor significance in a more intelligent group." So, and that was one of the doctors performing this experiment. So, race has a huge place here. There's a specific reason why these men were even chosen in the first place, which is because of the scientific racist idea that these black men are intensely sexually active and have overdeveloped sexual organs. And so race is everywhere in this. They can deny it, but it's the truth. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. And in 1930, penicillin was used for the first time to treat infection in a medical context. And then in 1942, after penicillin was used to treat the victims of the Boston Coconut Grove fires, it was widely taken on as the number one way to deal with infections, bacterial infections, by the U.S. military, by the general U.S. public, in the medical sense. So by 1942, penicillin was being widely used for infections. And we know that penicillin is a proper, most effective treatment for syphilis. So So, by 1942, penicillin had entered the medical sphere, and by 1945, penicillin was discovered to be extremely effective in treating syphilis. Now, you would think that the experiment would be over, because remember, the original intent of the experiment was to find out the syphilis issue, how to cure syphilis. That's where it started. Observing syphilis, trying to find a cure for syphilis by use of people who already had syphilis in the American South. So the experiment has turned into a racialized mess. It's turned into a racialized mess up until this point in 1945. And this is why I want to kind of harbor on this, and that's why we did a quick review, because in 1945, syphilis and penicillin, that was something that was widely known. There was a cure for it. But again, these men didn't know that they had syphilis that needed to be treated, and these people at the PHS did not want their experiment to be tampered with, and their experiment really was just to observe people dying of syphilis. What happens to the body when people die of syphilis. Another thing I want to put in here too is that a lot of these men, when World War II happened, a lot of these men would be the specific type of men that would be drafted, and a lot of them wanted to be drafted. The PHS went out of their way specifically to tell the military draft people in the area not to draft these people, because if they were drafted, they'd have to undergo the full physical examination to see if they were inept enough to fight and be a soldier in war for World War II, and then it would be revealed to them that they had syphilis. So again, the PHS went above their heads in order to continue having this shroud of secrecy around their actual health situation. So they wouldn't know. And I just want to say this too. World War II and being in the army is still one of the best possible ways for people to raise their family out of poverty. It's not an easy choice, and it's a sad choice. It's a choice overwhelmingly had to be made by people in poverty, but it's one of the most surefire ways for people to pull themselves and their family out of poverty, because of the GI Bill and benefits that that they're able to reap once they come back as soldiers of war. So on top of the fact that they kind of weren't telling and were watching these men die slowly from syphilis, and that was their experiment, even though that wasn't what it intentionally was, they also were going above their head and keeping these men in impoverished situations, because they were no longer allowed to be drafted to join the war, which would then provide them with, middle class benefits, college benefits, certain things that were a part of the GI Bill post World War II that would raise them into another socioeconomic place. So it was triply diabolical at this point. And the fact that penicillin was widely known by 1945 to be a cure, and this experiment went on until the 70s, is literally criminal. And they knew that. They knew there was a cure for syphilis. They just continued to want to see the effects of syphilis over a long period of time on Black people. So, anger isn't even the word. So, like I said before, this experiment went into the 70s, and we'll get into how it was, discovered because a whistleblower came out. But for most of the time this experiment was going on, there was an active, well-known cure of penicillin to cure syphilis. But of course, the intention of this experiment was to see the effects of syphilis untreated in the body. And the perfect population to do that with was the poor Black population. So this experiment went on for 40 fucking years, where these men didn't know they had syphilis, untreated, living like this for over 40 years. diabolical. And now let me read you the effects of this experiment. Why don't we? So, in total, 128 men died directly to having the progression of the syphilis infection. So 128 men died directly to the syphilis infection over the course of this experiment. 40 men also infected their wives, because that's another aspect of this. The family aspect. If you are going around having sex with your wife and you don't even know you have syphilis, you are putting her at risk of getting syphilis as well and not knowing, which means that, of course, naturally, if the wife gets syphilis, like we said before, syphilis can be passed down to an unborn child. So within those 40 people who passed the syphilis to their spouse, 19 of those men's children were born with syphilis. Again, through this experiment. And all of this persisted for years. And all of these people had syphilis for years because they were still a part of this experiment for 40 years. Isn't that, these numbers for some may not be huge and staggering, but, the fact that there were 600 people in this experiment initially and 128 died, just straight up died due to the effects of syphilis, and 40 of their wives were infected with syphilis, and 19 of the kids were born with syphilis. These are lifelong issues, and it's just diabolical. And all the experiment was meant to do was watch what happened to somebody if they died of syphilis, play close attention and measure their skull and do spinal taps and do rigorous experiments throughout to mark and pay attention to what exactly happens to a body when someone dies of syphilis untreated, when there was a treatment for syphilis in 1945 that they went above and beyond to not let these men have. Who would trust the medical system after that? That's so crazy. It's messed up. Another really messed up aspect of this whole situation was after World War II, I think we're all, or maybe all of us, should be familiar with the Nuremberg trials, which basically address the atrocities that happened in the concentration camps to the Jewish people and the marginalized people. It wasn't all Jewish people. There's black people. There's, Romney, gypsy people. There's lots of different, handicapped people, mentally ill people, all sorts of people were in those concentration camps. But the Nuremberg trials were basically public trials to, ask questions and make sense of the horrors that were experienced during World War II and what happened to that population of people, why the different experiments that were done on human bodies in those labor camps and stuff like that. And out of those trials came the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially is addressing the fact that in order to do some sort of scientific experiment on humans, it is important that you get their explicit consent for that experiment to be done on them before you do it. Now, like I said, this came out in the Tuskegee experiment became public and continued into the 1970s. So the Nuremberg codes happened after the end of World War II. So this was widely known information that in general, the Nuremberg Code was that we don't experiment unconsensually on human bodies. Let's just make that a rule. But of course, the U.S.'s response to the Nuremberg Code was, well, that code is only for uncivilized people and barbarians, and we're civilized people, so we don't have to adhere to the code. And it's just like, what? It's like, you're literally doing that right now to black people, and you're sitting here like, we're civilized, so it doesn't apply to us. And it's just like, this country is something. it's really something. So on July 25th, 1972, Jean Heller, from a reporter from the Associated Press, broke this story publicly, and she had been informed by a whistleblower who basically told her everything that was going wrong with the experiment that nobody had known about, because nobody talked about it, because it was secret, and it was happening to Black people, so nobody really cared because it wasn't being reported on. But she broke the story in 1972, and it, to huge public outrage, especially from the Black community, and major reverberations from this experiment, in the Black community, which we'll talk about later on in the conclusion. But she broke the story, and after the story broke, a governmental panel was formed to review what had happened, and basically they decided, even though the men consented to the free medical care, they did not explicitly consent to the syphilis experiment and not being untreated and all of that. So it was found to be unethical, and many lawsuits followed. I know that there was like a $12 million lawsuit that was filed on behalf of the families, of course, for damages. And the government was also and is also responsible for continuing to provide free health care to the families affected by this, and just free benefits in general, in addition to the money won for damages of the suit. And I won't say that's a happy ending, obviously, because it's like very much too little too late. A 40-year experiment that was very damaging to 600 Black families and such. It's just like really peanuts in terms of the psychological and physical effect it had on those 600 people, but as well as what it represented as the psychological trauma that it had on the Black population from that thereafter. Because obviously, there's many reasons to be suspicious of the United States government, but this situation coming out really showed how diabolical it was, even in the 20th century when it was supposed to have been a reformed place. And so the trauma reverberations of this coming out really affected the Black community. Like I said before, after this story came out, the Black male life expectancy dropped comparatively a percentage and some change. And, people relate it to this direct mistrust of the medical system because of the Tuskegee experiment being exposed. But, there's also other factors to that, poverty, violence, gun violence, things like that. But nevertheless, a lot of people attach it to initially the blow of the Tuskegee experiment. And we're still dealing with the effects of that story dropping to this day.
Continue to cope with the knowledge that their loved ones suffered unnecessarily and died prematurely. For them, any compensation from the government could not make up for the loss of their loved.
I mean, I'm just going to end it on this note. It's so important to be involved in your health. It is so important to be knowledgeable with what's going on with your body, both preventative care and aggressive care if you end up getting sick. It's so important to combine both leading a healthy, stable lifestyle with the fact that you are getting regular medical attention so a professional can see that you are healthy, and if there is something wrong with you, that they can treat it early and aggressively, like a cancer, like something like diabetes, things like that. It's so important. And the reason why the Black community, continues to be so particularly affected by COVID is largely related to the generational trauma and the mistrust of the governmental system as well as the medical system. And I understand that I understand that, like I said, I'm coming from a place of privilege. I've always had healthcare. There's medical people in my family. I can always ask someone that I trust if this is the right treatment for me, this and that. I can always have someone explain something that I don't understand. But I think it's so important to connect the health issues and the way we treat them in the Black community, as well as lack of access to healthcare, to why the COVID virus basically decimated our whole community. There are people who had 4, 5, 6, their entire family die over the course of these past 2 years. And it's all really central to the fact that there's a deep trauma and deep mistrust with the Black community and the medical system. And that needs to be publicly acknowledged and understood and handled with care, instead of kind of attacking a group of people for not getting the vaccine. I think it's really important to note, and this is something my therapist said to me and my family, our family therapist said, shout outs to you. But she said something really important that I think applies to everything, which is trauma is not your fault. It usually is something that happens to you, and you usually have no control over it. On the flip side, healing from that trauma, unfortunately, is 100% up to you. Period. And everyone goes through traumas, but specifically with these generational traumas that racialized groups deal with in this country, it's important to understand that. Like, the harsh reality of it is, it happened to us, and we are feeling the effects generationally of these choices based on this huge trauma. But in order to heal, it's 100% up to us to confront these things, to learn about these things, and to get the help we need. That's why I think all Black people should just be in therapy as a baseline, period. Because we need to uncover how things in our lives and choices and decisions and lack of access and all of these things are tied into our long history of being traumatized and re-traumatized in this country. And so I say that to say, again, this is a free country, so do with whatever information as you wish. I'm not here to preach to you, but what I am here to say is, one, you citing the Tuskegee Experiment as the same thing as a COVID vaccine is not correct. They did not inject these people with COVID. They just denied care to these people. Not just denied, but they denied care to people who already had syphilis. So let's make that clear. Secondly, like I said, we all have some level of trauma in our lives, specifically people of color, specifically Black people generationally. But again, especially as adults, it's up to you and it's up to me to heal it on our own, because no one is going to heal it for us. So go to therapy and talk to a professional in order to uncover these generational curses that we have to deal with and learn how to break. Thirdly, when it comes to the COVID vaccine, I feel like I laid out a good explanation as to why we as a population are suspicious of it and why we're hesitant of it. But on top of that, this Tuskegee experiment had ripple effects as to why we're more susceptible to it. And it's important, like I said, to do your research and to do your due diligence about whether this vaccine is dangerous or not. And overwhelmingly, the research shows that it is healthy, it is fine, and everyone should have it just to protect themselves. And remaining unvaccinated, to me at this point, is a sure shot to be severely ill, have a long haul situation, or to die. And if you're signing up for that, then that's up to you. But I really hope that you take the vaccine and take the time to take precautions. On top of that, another and the last thing I will say, it is so important that if you are not going to be vaccinated, that's a personal choice, but you can't force that choice onto other people. If you're not going to be vaccinated, then you need to do the other things to keep yourself safe and people around you safe and lower your chances of getting COVID. You can't be unvaccinated and also want to go to the bar and also want to go be maskless and be anti-mask and all of these things and anti-social distance. You gotta pick one and stay there. If you're gonna be unvaccinated, then you need to do the social distancing. You need to stay primarily at home and only shop essential things. You need to understand why you're not going to be allowed to go to restaurants and party, because it's unsafe for you and other people. And you need to wear a fucking mask. That's the least you can fucking do. Wear a fucking mask. Again, I'm not trying to be preachy. I'm just trying to help my people. It's time that we look in the mirror and stay on code. If we want to out-survive these people, then we need to get all the things and help ourselves to be able to remain healthy during this very sketchy ass time. Yeah. So that being said, I hope you liked the video. Again, this is Murder, She Told. This is my series, True Crime in Society. I have another series called Black Girl Reacts, where I react to documentaries. And if you like this video, please like it. Please comment down below. Tell me why or why not you got the vaccine. I'd love to hear your stories. And hopefully we can all provide a community of true facts and true information and help each other get healthier and more vaccinated. That is my ministry. I hope that you agree with me on that. And that being said, like, comment, subscribe, click that notification bell so you're notified anytime that I upload a video. And without further ado, Black Lives Matter and free Palestine until it's backwards. Love you guys.